This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for September 10th, 2022. And I'm doing these updates frequently because there's a lot to update people on. The offensive Ukraine launched, it was in two directions, outside of Kherson and outside of Kharkov, throughout the Kharkov region. The offensive outside of Kherson was obviously much larger. It was an abysmal failure. It made almost no territorial gains at all. What gains they did make were at the very fringe of Russian-held territory, and they lost entire brigades in this fighting. We're talking thousands of men dead and many thousands more injured, and this is something that even the Washington Post has admitted to. The offensive around the Kharkov region, this has been much more successful for Ukraine, at least in the short term. Let's go to the map, liveuamap.com. This is a very pro-Ukrainian, pro-NATO map, so keep that in mind. And even still, outside of Kherson, there is no major activity at all. That offensive is over with. But if we go to the Kharkov region, we see how Ukraine is pushing Russian forces all the way to the very edge of the Kharkov region. Now, we've actually seen this before. There was a previous Kharkov offensive where it was much more limited. Ukrainian forces pushed Russian forces almost over the border between Ukraine and Russia to the northeast of Kharkov city. Of course, by doing so, they extended themselves, they exposed themselves to counterattack, and those gains were very quickly reversed. It made for great headlines, of course, but ultimately it was a failure. Not only that, but because they had to assemble additional men to launch this offensive versus the defensive actions Ukraine was conducting for Kharkov city, they had to draw Ukrainian soldiers from other parts of the line of contact. And this came at the cost of the front lines in the Donbas region. They actually were filtering men off from that front line, sending them to Kharkov for this offensive. They were, I would say, wasted on that offensive, and it weakened the line in the Donbas. This is, I think, a contributing factor to Russia ultimately moving probably much faster onto Severodonetsk and Lysychansk than they would have otherwise. And then, because Russian forces were moving on Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, Ukraine had to pull forces from Kharkov to try to plug the gap there, and it allowed Russia to retake all of that territory around Kharkov. So as you can see, offensives for Ukraine are extremely unsustainable. They do not have the machines and the trained manpower to carry out an offensive and sustain the gains that they make by executing them. And I think we're going to see the very same thing take place here in this Kharkov offensive. You can see how much larger it is than the previous Kharkov offensive. But because they've committed many more troops and many more men, they have weakened the line of contact elsewhere to a much larger degree. They are putting men and machines into a position to be fired upon by Russian forces who are now assembling around this area that Ukraine has taken. And it's just a matter of time before these forces are ground down and these gains, these very temporary gains, are reversed. But it is not insignificant. The Russian forces at Izium, at least from my perspective, were protecting the flank of Russian forces fighting in the Donbas. What this offensive is going to do is two things. First of all, is taking the remaining manpower and machines that Ukraine had and concentrating them in one area for what you could say is a final showdown, so to speak. It's also going to force Russia to turn its attention toward this offensive and this concentration of manpower and machines. And again, when you do that, instead of a defense in depth along your front lines, now you concentrated everything into an offensive where you're highly exposed. This to me is a strategic blunder for Ukraine. A tactical success, no doubt, but a strategic blunder. Russian forces are already amassing opposite of this offensive, and they're playing it safe by withdrawing forces that could potentially be encircled and then captured or eliminated, which would be catastrophic. They're playing it safe by withdrawing them, reshaping the front line, because they are thinking about when they will counterattack, doing it on their terms. They're thinking about ultimately achieving victory. They're not thinking about today's headlines. Nothing has changed between the time Ukraine was losing across the entire line of contact and now that they're launching this counteroffensive. They're still suffering from deficiency in trained manpower, in heavy weapons and ammunition. That has not changed. And we can see these Western aid packages, each and every one, however much it is in dollars, they are talking about less ammunition for fewer heavy weapons being sent. This cannot even sustain Ukraine's current combat power, let alone enhance it to carry out sustainable offensives. This is exactly why the offensive around Kherson failed, and this is why no matter how, again, tactically successful this looks around Kharkov, strategically, in I would say even the near term, it is going to be a disaster. They're going to reach the limits, the full extent of how far they can go. They're going to be stretched out just like the previous Kharkov offensive, and Russian forces are going to work them back. Let's take a look at this article from The Guardian, kind of outdated, I would say, but from yesterday, because a lot is changing so quickly. Again, the tactical minutia is changing very quickly, but I think the strategic outcome of all of this is already very clear. Russia sends reinforcements to Kharkiv to repel Ukraine counterattack. The Guardian says Moscow is sending columns of military reinforcements to Ukraine's Kharkiv region, according to reports in Russian media, after the first major Ukrainian counterattack since spring made big territorial gains this week. This is an oblique admission that the Kherson offensive, much larger in scale, was an absolute failure, made no territorial gains worth mentioning. This is The Guardian, a very pro-Western, pro-Ukraine source admitting this. The article also says the next major Ukrainian target is likely to be the city of Kupiansk. You know, at the time of recording, there are rumors, nothing confirmed, that Ukraine has already taken Kupiansk, but because Russia is withdrawing from it. On Thursday, Russian occupation authorities said they plan to evacuate women and children from Kupiansk, citing Ukrainian artillery strikes on the town. Now, they're doing artillery strikes. This means this forward momentum that they had is grinding to a halt. I was listening to the Duran program that they did, Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mercouris, and they predicted, and I agree, that they will continue making limited gains from this point on, but this sweeping advance, that much is over. Russia is going to reform their lines, and they're going to rework their strategy. The advantage is still on the side of Russia in terms of firepower, in terms of logistics. Again, nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is that Ukraine has conveniently assembled this mass of troops and equipment for Russia to deal with. Now, how did this happen? Was this a huge surprise? I hear a lot of articles from the Western media saying Russia is totally surprised. I don't think that they were surprised. I think they were simply unable to stop this offensive. The priority was Kherson City. It is strategically and politically much more important than these areas in the Kharkov region. And I think they made a decision to defend Kherson, and I think they made a decision to give ground around Kharkov. It's not an easy decision. And I think ideally, if they could have, they would have liked to have blunted this offensive. They would have liked to have held off Ukrainian forces, but they cannot. Again, the Duran made a lot of really good points about the limitations of Russia fighting this conflict as a special military operation, short of declaring full-scale war on Ukraine. They have not done any kind of mobilization, as Ukraine has multiple waves of mobilizations. And so they have confined themselves to a certain degree, and especially in terms of infantry. They rely heavily I've said this throughout all of my reports heavily on local militias who have a lot of experience and they fight very hard, but their numbers are limited. You have to use them wisely, which is why when Ukrainian forces surge in like this, Russia prefers to withdraw and reform their lines rather than fight to the last man, because they are thinking about the long term. This most certainly generates very positive headlines for Ukraine, without a doubt. But for how long? Exactly like the previous Kharkov offensive, it was very short-lived. And I am certain that this is also very short-lived. In many ways, this was a strategic blunder on Ukraine's part. They are showing these massive gains to the public, to Ukraine, boosting morale, making their Western sponsors very, very happy. But in the long term, this is going to hasten Ukraine's defeat. Instead of conserving their forces for defense, they have expended them on these two very expensive offensives, Kherson and Kharkov. And now one more point I want to make about this special military operation. Russia, in a very similar way, confined itself in its method of fighting when it intervened in Syria in 2015. They did it for a multitude of reasons, long-term reasons that now in hindsight make perfect sense. But at the time, it was incredibly frustrating when you saw Russia spending all of this time and effort trying to get humanitarian aid in to areas the Syrian Arab army was besieging. These peace deals that Russia was bending over backwards to make between these militants, helping them withdraw from Syrian Arab army encirclements that Russia helped create. And also this habit of doing almost anything to avoid escalation with the United States and Turkey. Turkey at one point shot down a Russian warplane, and then Turkish-backed militants ambushed the rescue team dispatched afterwards. And it was an immense period of humiliation for Russia, and many people questioning whether Russia had the ability to see this out to the end. Of course, Russia did, and they have, and it has been a victory, a long-term victory for Russia, Syria, and Syria's other allies. And in hindsight, looking at the relationship Turkey now has with Russia, this would be impossible if Russia reacted in the short term, for short-term revenge, retaliating in some significant way against Ankara for shooting down its warplane. I think there's similar considerations being made in Moscow regarding operations in Ukraine, maintaining this as a special military operation short of total war. I don't think they will do that unless it is absolutely the last resort. They are thinking long term. They are thinking about healing the rifts in Ukraine as much as possible, somehow in the future salvaging Russia's relationship with Western Europe, understanding that the current leadership in power in Europe right now do not represent the European people and their best interests. So there's a lot of considerations being added to this other than just simply steamrolling over the Ukrainian army in Ukraine. Again, however frustrating it is to watch Ukrainian forces advance on the battlefield, or if you're excited about this offensive, however tempting it is to have raised hopes, consider the reality that all of the factors driving Ukraine's loss in this conflict all along still apply. Nothing has changed. They still are tremendously outgunned. Their logistics fall far short of Russia's capabilities. This offensive at Kharkov, this was right near the border with Russia. This is even easier for Russia to rectify than any sort of development around Kherson. And so just keep all of that in mind. Temper, if you're excited about this offensive, temper your hopes. And if you are panicking over this offensive, temper your panic. And again, go back to the fundamentals of what wins a war truly and what makes good headlines temporarily. And I think you will see how this is going to conclude. So this is going to be a very short update. I don't want to get into the tactical minutia. First of all, it's very hard to get accurate information regarding what is happening tactically hour by hour on the ground during this offensive. Ukraine is making progress, but it is slowing as they reach the limits of how far they can push into Russian-held territory. And now that Russian forces are mobilizing opposed to them, they will grind to a halt, and then it's just going to be a matter of what Russia decides to do. Hold the line there, continue pushing into the Donbas region, or reversing this very, very soon. Again, it was, I would say, a couple of weeks before the Kharkov offensive, the original Kharkov offensive, was reversed. So it could take time. This is a much larger amount of land. There are many more troops committed to it. But again, these are the best of what Ukraine has left. What wasn't destroyed in Kherson, what they could spare from the line of contact from north all the way to south. This is everything concentrated in one area. I don't think Russia would want to miss the opportunity of hammering this concentration of forces. So, but it remains to be seen. And if anything of strategic interest unfolds, I will do another update. Until then, if you thought this was interesting, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Please check the video description below, especially if you're watching this on YouTube, for other places you can find and follow my work. I'm on Telegram. I update things several times a day there, especially at times like this. I'm also on Rumble and Odyssey. All my YouTube videos are backed up automatically there. They'll show up in a day or two. Also in the video description below will be the link to this Guardian article, as well as to the, I think, a very well done discussion about Russia and the limitations of the special military operation by the Duran. That'll be in the video description, as well as ways you can help support my work. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also PayPal. And to everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. I could not do this work without that support. So again, thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.